The Lou at the Sioux. When the flood comes, there are basically two floods. There's the water flood that comes and destroys things in its way and turns the plate of the earth into a nova, but there's also the other aspect which raises gases out of the ground, and you can get what they call a dry flood of gas that will flow from this area, Kempville, towards Ottawa. The intent, I guess, is to make room for civil servants who will have to migrate from the U.S. and take over positions in government in Ottawa. We've seen that the national capital of Ottawa over the last few years has been amalgamated to the point where the farm area around Ottawa, now included into the city of Ottawa, has now made it to the largest footprint for a capital anywhere in the world. So obviously they're awaiting the arrival of a large number of Americans as soon as the Lou at the Sioux begins to occupy land in this area. They're also building at high speed one of the largest shopping centers you could find in a rural area, including people like Staples, Walmart, and other big American companies setting up in Canada. What precisely is the purpose of what we're doing here is somewhat in question, but it is and always has been suggested by Norse mythology that at the end times the northern hemisphere must be destroyed. 1,000 years later, the southern hemisphere, and then a waiting period for the passing of a new north star called Alder Amin. That there are to be, and there haven't been, from what we understand since the Ice Age, any real independent human birthing activity, but rather all of the birthing is being manipulated since the 18th dynasty in Egypt, which is somewhere around 1500 BC. Human beings are being raised like cattle, genetically engineered prior to birth, task-oriented in that genetic engineering, and then added into the existing populations in numbers that over time take over the genetics of any group, and is the reason why they use the word country for a specific genetic group of people. In the word country, if you take the O from the front and you put it in the back, the try becomes Troy, and the front part becomes cunt. Cunt Troy, or cunt is Troy. That's one of the ways they have of hiding and laughing at us over the things they're doing. It is intended that there will be a final war called Ragnarok, made of reanimated human beings who have proved themselves to be the best soldiers on the battlefield. Remember that China has been unearthing what they call an army of clay soldiers, which each individual, and there are thousands of them, has a different appearance, facial, body size, and whatever. They are the replica of the genetically engineered soldier at the end time that will be reanimated for the planet, and that there has to be an equivalent army constructed in the West. We know now that genetic engineering has been introduced into secret religions based upon ecclesiastic Freemasonry from at least the time of Hatshepsut in the 18th dynasty. A woman who wore a phony beard and ruled his region over Egypt even though it was illegal for anyone but a male to be in charge. The activity was repeated 100 years later by a male and a female called Ai and Tai, who ran the harem of the pharaoh from which we were born, Akhenaten, whose name is linked to that. The existing priesthood of the day was Amen, and he was Akhen-Ten, which said that so many changes down the road they would have the species that they call human modified to their rules and regulations. Akhenaten's grandparents were, of course, linked to an Egyptian family called Tutmosis. He left Egypt with a formula for the genetic engineering of human beings under the name Moses. He brought it to Jordan, from where they waited out the 40 years necessary for people in those days to die off so that nobody would have the knowledge of the connection. Then moved in under King Saul to create out of Palestine a state called Israel. Israel's name was derived from the wife of the first family that left Media and Iran to go to Palestine to begin a new religion. The wife of the family was Sarah. If you add the pronoun le as you do in French for the, that makes Israel. The Snowden family has its origins in Israel as well. This entire area, I'm told, is to be divided into three parts. One place where the soldiers who will fight the war on behalf of the West will be animated. The meeting place in the center, and in the east, as the bodies are produced on the western side by nuns, the soldiers will take their place. If you look at the map and look for an area called Morrisburg in Ontario, just between us and the Quebec border, that's where the war is supposed to take place. Now, if during a war one were to use a dry flood, you can in fact kill off the two armies. which is basically what they did in the 18th dynasty with Tutankhamun and his brother Smenkhare, who fought each other to the death so that the genetic engineers Ai and Tai could take over. I'm currently 71 years old now, and I lived on the border of the province of Quebec in Ottawa and could never understand how come in our region of Ontario, the average family size was 3 or 4, but in Quebec, the average family size was 10, 12, 15, 20 children. I had trouble trying to figure out how a family can exist with that many children and where did they come from, because making 15 or 20 kids in each family seemed to be an awful burden on a couple. But now that I understand the children that they physically made were only a fraction of that, and the absorption into the family of a number of manufactured children, manufactured by the nuns at the local monasteries, would explain what was going on. By manufacturing task-oriented children and inserting them into families and providing them an income on which to live would make it something that would interest the parents. Catholic families seem to have repeated that process in Western Canada and down into the United States, Montana, Oregon, into California. If you genetically engineer a race by introducing a number of people you have task-oriented and manufactured to take it over, these people, of course, will pass down their gene pool on a 4-generational basis, which means 80 to 100 years of descendants from those manufactured people. It's easy enough to spot, since most of these factories were centered around prison colonies, that personality was important to the people who were genetically engineering people. If in your prison you had 100 rapists or 100 mass murderers sent from all over the world, as they did in Ogdensburg, New York, and later moved to Australia, it would be fairly simple for the engineers to figure out which gene needed to be input into the individual they were making to replicate its personality. To make it a psychopath, make it a mass murderer or sexual predator. But these, I suggest, are the exceptions to the rule. The majority of the population was basically too smart. I'm not talking about intelligent. I'm talking about people who can think on their feet rather than obtain the information from a book. They needed these smart people to develop a space program. But if you're going to make a race, there are too many of them that are not involved directly in making the space program. They become a problem to the master because they don't basically listen to what they're being ordered to do without prior discussion. So dumbing down is one feature that was applied in search of mediocrity, and a dumbed down mediocre race makes a great bureaucracy. People who, for personal gain, will follow instructions without question. One doesn't have to look too far outside of New York State, Ontario, and Quebec to come to the conclusion that this was the center activity that led to the creation of a bureaucracy. The state bureaucracy in New York, which was planned in Massachusetts and tracked in Maryland, was created in the center point between Quebec, New York State, and Ontario. These are the people who are in charge today. All of this stuff had its origins before the Ice Age, and it all has a very defined process by which it evolved. The eldest trees being as old as 80 million years, collecting information. They do it in a ring because the tree is basically static and can only record information which goes by it, such as which summer was warm, which winter was really cold, if there was a lot of rain. All of that stuff is recorded in a tree. It takes water from the ground, reanimates the tree. Just as you were reanimating a human being, it collects energy and information through the branches and the leaves and then returns the information to the land. And when it does, the leaves change color, dry up, and fall off. Human beings are not much different than the tree and the animals, dinosaurs or whatever, that lived in between 80 million years ago and today. There's only one exception. They are in motion. Human beings, like all animals, are born in one place but don't necessarily stay in that one place. They collect information in their region and eventually end up wanderers in the countries of the world, collecting information. So memory is at the heart of all that we're learning, and the reason why the company that manufactured the BlackBerry is called Research in Motion, changed their name recently, but RIM, which Mir in Russian means child or son, is basically what they were all about. They were about building trees that would gather information at the furthest distance than the place they were born in. In order to do that with human beings, of course, you use tools called war, pestilence, famine, and disease to cause people to pack up in mass as a group and leave the place they were born and go to another region in which they will then bring with them their genetic pool. You saw that happening when Arabs went through Africa collecting black people, putting them on boats and shipping them across to the West, where they would be slaves of white people. Of course, the master, who has the gene of a sexual predator, will move some of its gene pool into the black population, and contrary, the black population used as slaves and going into the homes of white people will do the opposite from a place called a harem, or in New York State, Harlem. So there is kind of a consensual discontent going on all the time with groups of people being moved from one place where they were manufactured to another place where their personality traits are needed to infest or infect, whatever you want to call it, another group of manufactured people and change the totality of their genome. That's what we have seen develop over the years. To go into all of the details of that which we've collected with the help of the cell over the last 4 to 5 years, as I told the government, would take a minimum of an hour and a half sessions 4 times. Unless it's recorded, no one will even remember all of it because it's been designed that our brain is able to listen to something 45 minutes. Then we start losing touch with what is being spoken. So that's the general picture of what we're seeing now. Dr. Wilder Penfield was an American neurologist from, I believe, Washington State originally. He was studying memory, by the way. Wilder is code word and Penfield is another combined code word, so he was genetically engineered for this particular task. He went to attempt to get funding for an experiment that he wanted to carry out. It ended with him getting details about what he wanted to do in a laboratory to study how memory really works, and was denied support by the U.S. government because it was considered to be inhumane or tampering with the laws of creation. So he was unable to proceed there, but out stepped the Rockefeller family, and they agreed to support his research, but he would have to move to Montreal to be outside of the border of the United States. He did so, and at McGill University in Montreal created the Montreal Neurological Institute, from where he proceeded to do his investigations. The main end result of his investigations were that in open-head surgery he was able to prove to anybody standing by and watching that the brain functioned in a fairly simple way. It basically recorded what is known as the pineal gland, the information in what appeared to be a frame-by-frame process, gathering up all the information from day one birth to the day one dies. One would discover along the way that some of the things that were being learned were traumatic to the extent that it would debilitate the individual from normal daily life. When that occurred, a compartment was opened up. That memory was moved to the compartment and it was shipped into the subconscious. But in opening up that brain to his manipulations, he was able to demonstrate that you could turn memory back, or as one would see on a tape deck, fast forward or at slow speed minute by minute. Wherever he stopped, the individual on the operating table would not only recount an event that had occurred, but relive it. It would be more like a video and an audio tape combined of the event than just memory of the event. He could basically move it back in. If there was a gap, know that that could be retrieved from the subconscious. All of this being done by the in-between brain, which sits someplace above the spinal column and below the brain itself. He could in fact play with the individual by tapping on the brain to move the story backwards or forwards in its memory. One of the things he also discovered was that the brain did not keep its entire memory in one place, physically speaking. That is, a person was injured and a part of the brain was destroyed, the memories were lost. However, over time that followed the injury, that memory was regained into a different portion of the brain, which suggested to him that there was a storage place outside the head where information was being backed up. Much like a computer uses a hard drive and then a flash drive to make information that was primarily in the brain portable should something happen to the hard drive. After all, the computer is designed on human beings, and it's from these lessons on the human body that people built computers. With all of that information provided to him, he concluded that the backup were the memories on human beings and the glands located within the region of the memories. The word memory is made of 2 parts. Mam, most ancient matron, so the original clan mothers of Africa, and memory is basically where the information is stored. And as soon as the brain is no longer ill, even though part of it has been destroyed, there is a call up and a downloading or uploading to the brain from the memory in the memory. That is basically making a long story short, is what he concluded was how human beings worked. He got from the scientific community a clash of opinions, which suggested that his patients, the human beings he had a slab in front of him during these open head operations, may not be telling the truth.
that they may be inventing stories as they go along, that he had no way of confirming that what they were saying had actually occurred, concluding that the only way around the situation would be to genetically engineer certain talents. Art on paper, dance and lifestyle, social engineering would have to be orchestrated in a trial model from beginning to end. That would mean you would have to manufacture a baby in a nunnery, send that baby to a known family, have that baby involved in a ritualistic stress on very specific occasions during its entire life. In other words, as a baby, the parents must, on a very specific day, very specific date, abuse that child physically and or sexually. That as life proceeded, that abuse would be transferred to babysitters and later on to teachers, and from teachers to friends, from friends to kidnappers, from kidnappers to the medical profession, doctors, psychiatrists, therapists, the rapists. Under each circumstance, detailed records would be kept. Our belief is that in 1955, just following his retirement, Dr. Wilder Penfield started tracking a child. The parents were being paid a fee, and the parents were told where to live. The child was born in Ogdensburg, which in 1867 had been described by the New York Times as Ogdensburg, Canada. Someday, on purpose, following the Ogdensburg Agreement, drew the border between Canada and the United States slightly to the north of where it should have been. Therefore, put Ogdensburg into the U.S., that forced the baby makers, the Grey Nuns of Montreal and Ottawa, to move in 1869 to Ogdensburg, and for 100 years after, made babies from the prison colony that existed underground along the Seaway, and the prisons that were placed in northern New York, where the system wanted to get prisoners away from the principal cities. The building of the Erie Canal made it quite easy to put somebody on a barge in New York City and send them up to Troy, then cross, they would disembark and put them in a prison in Ogdensburg, from which babies were made. If you look at the newspaper in 1955, there's a story there about Grey Nuns having a garage sale type of thing, except that what they were distributing was free of charge, and they were babies. 200 to 300 babies laid out in cribs on the top floor of what was the monastery. They call it a cone zent. People were invited from all over the United States to come to Ogdensburg and pick out a child. It would be free. However, it would have no papers, but they were advised once they got back to their region to simply call a bishop or equivalent in other religions, who would give them a birth certificate and later on a baptismal or whatever certificate was needed by that religion. One of the children born in 1955 that went to a family who took it into Montana was Jennifer, my wife. Their family grew to have 4 more girls, but Jennifer was never treated in the same way as the other girls. Special treatment for her was not necessarily positive. It actually was negative in the most part, but simply followed upon the ritualistic activity that the parents were charged with. Both mother, father were teachers, and eventually the father was chased out for what seems to be child abuse. Then they took up their living space in Southern California, Anaheim to be exact, right where the abuser of children called Walt Disney set up Disneyland. That allows for a lot of parents with similar children to bring them to a central location, send them to a location while they attend classes on how to advance the cause of the system. It's closest to the largest U.S. Navy bases in the Pacific, who take care of some of the kidnapping of these children and ritual abuse into their adulthood. Everything recorded from 1955 on becomes part of the record in a hospital, and from the hospital, federal laws are imposed upon local hospitals. Reporting has to be done to a central place on how the patients came in, what their problems were, and the overall experience they had in the time they were in the hospital. But then the next comes in where the federal government orders different reporting structures that meet other requirements than the one of getting the patient better. Those reports are worked on and stored in Maryland, which just happens to be the headquarters of the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy is not something that just popped out of the ground and became mariners.
They are descendants of all navies before them, because how could a country send people to another country en masse without ships? If you go back in time, they were known as Phoenicians. Sheehan at the end is linked to Cain, the builder, because it's spelled C-I-A-N, and Cain is spelled C-A-I-N. Phonetics is the first part of the word, which meant that they could deal with many different populations that they would plant all over the world with a different language.
the phonetics of the language and the pictographs of the writing they would know. Every time you see a picture of someone arriving from Spain or Portugal to a new country, the guy sitting next to them was a priest. He would decipher what the people who were already there knew and teach languages to the people they were bringing, who would be inserted into the gene pool. In other words, the period in time between the Ice Age, the last fourth Ice Age, if you're writing down numbers, would be 24,000 BC to 8,000 BC, a period of 16,000 years. That's the marker between the original people who were first evolved through creation from the trees, the plants, the other animals by the combination of genetic material sent to Earth from outside the solar system, aka the Oort cloud, through the arrival of comets. Over the millions of years, the evolution basically came together in all parts under the right conditions. In fact, created a new version of trees or a new version of animals. For example, the dinosaur and then a new version of an animal such as the human being. Once the lesson was taught, for instance, dinosaurs may be the biggest animal in the world, but also the dumbest since today. It is not needed for the purpose that system has in mind of creating a mind that walks and is in motion. So some material arrives by comet, which causes the destruction of the existing ruling race of animals, and others lay down the foundation for the genetics needed for smaller but smarter animal called human. Over approximately 130,000 BC to 80,000 BC. Between 130,000 and 80,000 BC is 50,000 years humans lived as they were made. Unfortunately, for most of them, what ended up becoming males were in one place, and those that ended up being female were in a different place, separated by the Mediterranean Sea and the mountains of Europe, until about 80,000 BC, where they came together. When they came together and had sexual relations, they began to understand the process through which genetic engineering could evolve. What evolved is evolution, E-V-I-L, instead of E-V-O-L. Which basically means the taking away of the intended process of creation and transferring it to a group of people who claim the rights of creation and call themselves God, linked to the word dog backwards, dogs and bitches. They worked out the process between 80,000 BC and 60,000 BC, which they could make babies and understand what was happening and what role the male played and what role the female played. The babies born that were male went with the Neanderthals, and the babies born that were female went with the women who were later called Amazons from North Africa. Until they thought they were learning, but as they learned and developed archives, one group and then the other felt that they were the principal partner in the deal and didn't need the other one's assistance if in fact decided to genetically engineer their own. So the males basically sacrificed females to steal their eggs, while the females gathered sperm from the males and put it in some kind of lab. Each one had some of each of the others and went back to doing their own thing a couple thousand years by themselves. At one stage of the game, the male side of things, Neanderthalers, lost a large number of people in a landslide of snow called an avalanche. An avalanche is a kind of instant death in a matter of minutes, followed by instant freezing called cryogenics today. If a person or animal dies in freezing conditions, the spot on the ground where they died will change colors. In non-freezing conditions, the place you bury them will also change colors. So there seems to be a kind of three-step process, because first there's death. Second, there's immediate loss of life energy that's absorbed by grass surrounding it and changes its color. Later, as the whole body has been consumed, a final loss of life energy usually will change the color of the grass at the place the body was buried. So there appears to be a three-step process in birthing. One, you need an egg, a real egg from a real woman or a genetically engineered woman, which means basically you open it up, take out what's in it, and put in what you want instead. The next thing is the fertilization of that egg. The third thing is the addition of life force in a step-by-step process with human beings. 9 months developing a fetus from beginning to end. That can only be done, they were to discover, if the fertilized egg was in a sac containing a liquid which resembles water. Amniotic fluid means water that's had additions to it. The lesson was taught to the Neanderthaler when they would retrieve some of the people who had died in the avalanche and put them in a place to melt them down, find out basically how they died again, and that was the end of it. Later on, somebody had the idea that you had to slow down the thawing process, and they put them in a room where they could control the temperature and drop it slowly. They found out that there wasn't much difference from doing it quickly if it was done in a room. It was suggested then that maybe a transparent vase of some kind that they could look at filled with seawater would in fact bring this thing to life. Salt in any recipe has not only the ability to give you a salty taste, but sodium enhances the flavor of everything else that's been put in the recipe. In all, they made a solution using the sap of trees that bore fruit as a basis instead of a straight seawater solution. They mixed the two of them together and watched the meltdown of the original person and then pulled them out, seeing the bubbling or changing color, whatever effect of the liquid, and then put the fertilized egg in there and saw how it interacted with the egg and caused a new birth. There is a suggestion that at one stage of the game, the fetus could be taken out, inserted into an animal to be carried to term. The animal suggested is a sea cow, a manatee, that kind of animal, a whale, or which is linked to the word male. In any event, they found out that they could reanimate the DNA of one person from the egg and sperm if it's properly done in a laboratory. That was the lesson learned in the 18th dynasty Egypt, which was given to them from the people who had developed prior to the Ice Age. The reason for the period in time we're in, 8000 BC forward to 8000 AD, is basically a laboratory. The people before the Ice Age who used the technology they had developed to master the race, very well known in secret societies as ascended masters, they in fact passed down the information secretly, known only by two separate groups, one male and one female. These groups call themselves ecclesiastic Freemasonry and hide behind the scenes to manage everything in the period of time, the 16,000 years, which is the time we are now at, 10,000 years. Akhenaten. So now we've done what we're sent to do. We grew from a few 100,000 people to 7 billion people, genetically assisted, of course. We know by the writings of the writers of the 1500s, when the Bible was written and the New Atlantis was written, that they consider the period of time from 4000 BC to 2000 AD to be known as the College of 6 Days, one day being 1,000 years. So that's where the story of making a woman from Adam's rib, Eve is the woman that was made, which is basically tells you up front, this isn't going to be the last version. This is the penultimate version, Eve, woman. Over the period of the last 6,000 years, we have accomplished everything they were looking for. One thing they were looking for was to be able to test on a large enough group of people. War, pestilence, famine, and disease. Unless you have a large enough group of people to do it with, you can't be sure of the end result. Now they are. Another thing they've learned is that you can make anything you want in a task-specific world. You can make people who are smart, not smart. You can make all kinds of people. You can make people who consider themselves masters. You can make people who consider themselves destroyers. All of these things are all possible. They've done it. Now the time has come where the information they've gathered has to be assembled, retested without the interference of those who did the original investigations. Most of the original investigations were done in the north. The northern hemisphere contains 6 billion people, and the southern hemisphere contains 1 billion people. From the 6 billion people, they have to go through a process of mass destruction to eliminate as many as they can, leaving 1 billion in the southern hemisphere, which basically means South America, South Africa, not the country but the location, and Australia and New Zealand. That gives you 3 and 1. 1, 3, or 13, like 2013. They are waiting there for the opportunity to begin the process of reviewing the archives. For that purpose, the surplus money that had been sent from the West and turned into gold and made part of Hindu society is transferred to Brazil now. They will have the same task in Brazil as India had during our period here. The journey of the money is basically symbolized by the movement of the Orange Lodge leading to merging with the nuns. Gray nuns, blue nuns, they're all kinds of nuns, but they all have the same purpose. That's to have God's children. Then place them out into society. A symbol had to be created for this, and it's known in the world as the Jewish Holocaust. We are now told that the internet was to destroy the Jewish people by Nazi in Germany. No, the intent was to destroy the Jewish people by Nazi in Germany. But if you know the history of Germany, you know the people there came from Israel. During the diaspora, to set up the biggest Jewish state in Germany that was in place until the late 1800s or early 1900s. So it's kind of like a civil war. They changed religion for the purpose of doing what they had to do. To disguise what they had to do to enhance the memory of why they did what they did. They begin by gathering gypsies, assembling them into concentration camps. Then they assembled the non-heterosexuals, then Freemasons, finally turning their attention to Jewish people. The total number killed is not coincidental, but based on the College of 6 Days. 6 million. So instead of 6 billion, the first gang is 6 million. It all happened in the period prior to the reanimation of the State of Israel in 1949. 49 being a 13, the same border, the 49th parallel, applied between the United States and Canada. Not by accident, it's all confirmation of where they sit with their plan at any specific time. Along the way of manufacturing people the way they did, they discovered that the amniotic fluid in which the babies were born had an effect on what we call personality, and it's what the medical profession calls humor. It was by trial and error that they tested different fruit trees as a mixture that could be added during the genetic engineering of the fetus. They went through the process of palm trees, coconut, then into fig trees and plum trees. Orange seems to be a very helpful fruit to use, so it was sent from India to China, back to India, and then distributed step by step all over the world. The latest one to receive from Japan, the orange, after it was traveled all across Europe, then North Africa to America, then across to Japan, is now in Brazil. Brazil is the largest distributor of oranges in the world. However, they did find by accident while they were in Montreal, Canada, that there was something in the water coming from the St. Lawrence that seemed to be better than fruit juice. In other words, when you make a fruit, you lose some of the quality of the sap. Therefore, what they had discovered 2,000 years before was that there was a tree in Canada that in fact made no fruit in the common sense of a peach. The latest one they have been using was the apple, and that's where the story of Johnny Appleseed comes from, bringing apple seeds to create an orchard and a Bible to read. The two of them together will tell you what your true mission in life is, and that's to make babies for God, who follow the instructions set into their DNA. The maple tree is kind of a version of the apple tree, but more female than male. The word apple, of course, starts with APP, which is the word pap. Everybody knows that what a pap smear is, and what it's all about in the original sense of the word pap was the breast, because the breast feeds, it nurtures. That's why the name Pope at the Vatican is the English version of the French word pap, which comes from Latin. The mother seed, as opposed to the father seed, is more likely to be closer to what they are looking for. They call Ogdensburg the Maple City. They also have drawn throughout the layout of their streets fish as part of their map. So there's a context there of salmon going home to spawn. They turn red and die. Maple goes home to create leaves and move sugar. That's why they call them sugar maples, and then at the end of the season, out drops the sap. The leaves turn red where there's been the most sugar, fall off of the tree and wait for another season. In spring, of course, those who make maple syrup will gather up the sap as it's rising on those very cold nights. But sunny in the morning, which causes the sap to rise, and they kind of hijack a portion of it, then filter it. In the filtering of sap, it takes about 1,000 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup, which makes it kind of strange as to why people would go through that much trouble. Much of what is made in the way of maple syrup, the high quality stuff, is put into warehouses for whatever reason. Not much of it gets on the market. Only the darker stuff has more bark taste ends up on the market for sale. Recently there's been a hijacking. Somebody broke in and stole thousands of tons of maple syrup from a warehouse in Quebec. I don't know where it's going, but I can vouch that it's in some genetic engineering lab someplace. But if you go back in time, there was a time in ancient times before the Ice Age where a group of people who were known as the Golden Hordes came from the Himalayas, set up in the Caucasus Mountains, had a group of descendants which are known as Caucasians. Their first batch of Caucasians were white, blonde hair in Europe, Scandinavia, Finland, and Russia mostly. Finland is the country that has kind of kept immigrants from migrating there. That's why they call them Finnish. Therefore, they have a very distinct genome linked to Caucasians. If you study the Finns, you'll find out there are two versions of Caucasians. The second had to be created because the first version was linked to Asian, and they wanted a milder version for what they wanted them to do in America. That's linked to the maple.